Thank you very much. Good morning and good afternoon, Mr. Chair, Ambassador Riyad Mansour, my fellow panelists, and ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor and a privilege for me to address this committee today, although, of course, I would have loved if it had happened in better circumstances, as it's quite alarming and shameful that as we are meeting here today, the deliberate killing of Palestinians, including women and girls, has not ceased, despite the fact that there is a quote-unquote ceasefire in place, yet hundreds of Palestinians continue to be killed. As it's my first meeting with you, I have to admit that since becoming a mandate holder, I have never confronted a situation as daunting as the one we had since October 2023. Documenting the human rights violations of the last 2 years and acting on them has been a challenge beyond description, primarily because it has been impossible to do justice to defining and describing the crimes and horrors that Palestinians, including women and girls, which are under my mandate, have been subjected to. As I have been saying, it is my belief that the current legal terminology, the concepts, and the legal frameworks that we have are inadequate in front of the monstrosity and the scale and the horrors of what Palestinians have been going through, particularly over the last 2 years, and including women and girls. Just to give one example, it became very clear to me that referring to the deliberate mass killing of Palestinian women, because they are both Palestinian and female, could no longer be adequately encapsulated by the term and the concept of femicide, which, as we know, is what describes the deliberate killing of women and girls because they are female. Instead, it was clear to me that the mass killing of Palestinian women and girls was happening with the intent to destroy them, and through them, the larger group to which they pertain, the Palestinian people in whole or in part. In other words, it was clearly a tool of genocide and in the service of it. Hence, I characterized in my last report to the Human Rights Council the killing of Palestinian women as femi-genocide, which is a term that was first coined by an Argentine anthropologist, Rita Laura Segato, to describe precisely what I've just described, the systematic violence against women rooted in patriarchal, racial, and colonial power structures. Now, if we look at the bigger picture, in fact, every act committed by Israel was geared to serve the overall objective of destroying the Palestinian people and ethnically cleansing Gaza and also the wider Palestinian occupied land. That is why every sector and other colleagues of mine working on thematic issues have also struggled with terminology and have also described things like ecocide, environmental destruction through toxic weapons, domicide, intended erasure of homes, scholasticides, the deliberate and mass elimination of schools and destruction of education. And I even know of the description used to describe the collapse of international law due to Israel's impunity, legal side. Moreover, and after the beginning of the genocide, it has become very clear to me also as a mandate holder, from observing and studying the modus operandi, scale, and intent, that reproductive violence was very much used as a genocidal tool in Gaza. Again, therefore, as a deliberate tool to impose measures to prevent births within the group, as described by the Convention on the Prevention of Genocide. And I was very glad that South Africa included that in its legal brief and arguments in front of the ICJ, and that the ICJ also made a reference to this article. And I was also very pleased that the Commission of Inquiry on Palestine reached the same conclusion, elaborating in one of its reports in detail how Israel has systematically targeted reproductive health facilities, maternity hospital clinics, including the IVF clinics, destroying access to life-saving care for women and infants, not to mention what we have all documented, including myself shortly after the start of the onslaught on Gaza, the widespread and rampant sexual violence, torture, arbitrary detention, forced disappearance, and psychological violence being inflicted on men, boys, women, and girls. Mr. Chair, ladies and gentlemen, I know we might sound like broken records, but we cannot underestimate the enormous damage that is being inflicted on the international legal framework and the rule-based order. What we have said repeatedly is, and it continues to be relevant today, is that what happens in Palestine does not stay in Palestine. The fact that crimes against Palestinians, including women and girls, can continue with such impunity has shown the weakness also of the feminist discourse and feminist policy. For all the concerns that are raised about global regression in the rights of women, or the pushback as we hear, the continuity of the killing of Palestinian women and girls in the thousands and the infliction of horrors on them is really the most defining moment that declares that the world no longer cares, in fact, for the lives of women and girls or their safety or their dignity. And we already see the ramification of the normalization of such brutality elsewhere, most recently in Sudan. It's as if what is happening in Sudan is using the playbook of what was inflicted on women and girls in Gaza. And it is really, really alarming that after 2 years of the world watching a genocide unfolding on its screen, we have normalized it to such an extent that no one now bats an eyelid about what is happening to women and girls in conflict and crisis situations elsewhere. So as I said, what happens in Palestine does not stay in Palestine. It has also exposed the double standards in the feminist discourses of organizations and states alike. I continue to find it very disappointing that despite the wide documented sexual violence that has been committed by Israel and its forces against Palestinians, including women and girls, states have continued to be very timid on this issue and not to address it, including those that have feminist foreign policies. And we have seen also how this discourse on human rights has also shattered with the reaction to the pro-Palestinian movements around the world. Female human rights defenders that have been detained and imprisoned, including those participating on the flotilla, have been subjected also to very gendered punishment and consequence and violence. Now, since this session is also about accountability, I would just like to reiterate one point. In my view, and this does not apply only to what has happened in Gaza or the West Bank recently, but really is relevant to the last 8 decades of Palestinian, of the dispossession of Palestinians since the Nakba. In my view, there is an insufficient consideration of how Palestinian women and girls experience these oppressions and realities in the ongoing accountability processes. So in the deliberations of international courts and prosecutors, and also some human rights mechanism. So if I can mention one example, the ICJ advisory opinion of July 2024 on the legal consequences arising from Israel's policies in the OPT failed to mention the very specific and distinct ways in which Palestinian women and girls are affected by Israel's occupation and apartheid, especially regarding family life, freedom of movement, access to health, including reproductive health rights and vulnerability to violence. Also, the General Assembly resolution that reaffirms the findings of the ICJ advisory opinion of July 2024 was also sex and gender blind. Now, this is, in my view, a lost opportunity. We have to document and do justice to the specific gendered experience of Palestinian women and girls, which constitute, after all, half of the Palestinian people, and demand accountability and reparations for them. And we should perhaps also start with the Palestinian women detainees that were also recently released as part of the ceasefire arrangements. Even the last advisory opinion by the ICJ, rendered in October 2025, made only one reference to the fact that by withholding assistance, humanitarian assistance, Israel had breached its obligation under CEDAW, which requires it to ensure non-discrimination in accessing health services for women. But again, in my view, this is not enough. And this sex and gender blindness when it comes to accountability procedures for Palestinians must be reversed. I also would like to mention that with regards to states that continue to cooperate with Israel, including through the export of weapons, they also are violating their international obligation towards women and girls set out in the various international instruments. And we have to continue to hold also these states accountable because these obligations are also included in their own national export risk assessments. They are under obligation not to export arms to places and to countries or actors that commit violations against women and children. And this is one of the recommendations I also made in my report to the UK after my visit in 2024. I think the priority right now also is to ensure that independent human rights mechanisms like ourselves can access the occupied Palestinian territories, and that we are able to also document the horrors that were committed on October 7th and since October 7th against all. Thank you very much.